Mr. Master of Ceremonies, High Commissioner of Canada to Jamaica, Managing Director of the Development Bank of Jamaica, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the board of the Development Bank, visiting investors, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good morning. First, I'd like to congratulate the Development Bank of Jamaica for this, I believe, is the 9th successive conference of this nature that is bringing a focus to areas that are crucial and critical to Jamaica's growth and development. And I'm happy that you've juxtaposed a number of areas that to some may seem unrelated, private equity, infrastructure, and SME, but all of which are individually very important and even considered together of extreme importance if we are to get where we need to be. Jamaica's evolution over the past several years, as far as our economy is concerned, has taken a path that many would have considered to be, let me use my words carefully, many would have not necessarily foreseen. Because we are in a period today that is characterized by the greatest sort of levels of opportunity that we have had in Jamaica over a number of decades. It's important that we secure what we have and make sure that this period lasts for as long as possible. And you've heard me speak at length about the institutional framework that we hope to put in place to ensure that the incentive structures are there for good policy making going forward, and that we take responsibility for the vulnerability that we face. And I don't miss an opportunity to mention that institutional framework of ensuring that we have a strong and resourced and well-governed central bank that has independence as far as monetary policy implementation is concerned. We have a credible and durable fiscal council that can last the test of time, and there's no artificial date for its imposition. You know, a law has to be passed, you have to get support for that, and it has to be properly staffed, people trained and recruited. And the third element is ensuring that we don't leave ourselves open to the risk of natural disaster without making adequate provisions. Now, Jamaica, over a long period of time, I don't know how many of you sort of still read the reviews that the fund puts out on Jamaica, but in the last review, there was a big section on capital expenditure and infrastructure, and it's very useful to look at because it puts a lot of things in context. Now, infrastructure has been associated with dynamism in growth and development ever since the dawn of civilization, both in the East and in the West. And I'll give a Western example because it's an easy point of reference given our own history. The Roman Empire was the biggest and most successful empire the world had seen for 2,000 years. I.e., after its demise, it was nearly 2,000 years later, I mean, obviously under 2,000, that we'd have seen any other country or political entity that would rise to the level of power and stature of Rome. And the Roman Empire was able to secure its position on the basis of unparalleled investment in infrastructure over a long period of time. There are over 60,000 miles of road networks that were built by the Romans that allowed them to penetrate all across Europe, across the Channel, and into the United Kingdom. They would have pioneered new ways of constructing roads with, different layers of sand and gravel, and then those flat stones on top. And those road networks were used primarily to transport troops and to transport supplies that kept those troops well stocked. And with the infrastructure from the road network that they were able to put in place, the Romans were able to not only conquer new territory, but to secure the territories that they had and to keep them well stocked and supplied. Their investment in infrastructure went beyond roads and road networks. They pioneered drainage and sewage and water systems. Indeed, the aqueducts built over 2,000 years are still with us, and all across Europe, and the Europeans brought some of those here with them. And those aqueducts were feats of engineering genius, because without pumps and electricity, just using gravity and very carefully articulated slopes, they were able to move water from sources far away into deeply populated towns, bringing forth civil, life in cities in larger and larger numbers than had existed before. And we know cities lead, when people can live together and work together, the kind of innovation that you get is far greater than if you live, in sparse areas. And the ability to supply fresh water allowed, as I said, for densely populated communities, and those waters were used in baths and fountains and for other purposes as well. There was an interesting paper that was recently produced that made the case and the argument that the development in Europe today can be traced to the infrastructure investments that were made by the Romans 2,000 years before. They went into detail and they looked at the 60,000 miles of road network, of which there's a lot of data that exists, and superimposed modern day Europe on that road network, and using as proxies for development and growth night light and the light that you can see from the sky, and population counts and GDP and so forth. And we're able to make the case that the investment in infrastructure would have opened up areas that would have led to further investment, and those areas became cities or towns, and they grew faster than other areas that did not have access to roads. Now that conforms with our anecdotal understanding that, of course, infrastructure investment is a prerequisite for growth and development. And the more infrastructure investment that we have is the more the corridors of growth and development can be fed, so to speak. Now, in the Jamaican context, there was a time when our investment in capital and infrastructure expenditure would have been double digits as a percentage of GDP. But that was a very, very, very long time ago. Our multi-decade long experience with debt would have meant that the fiscal space that would have otherwise been available for investment in infrastructure would have been compromised by the need for debt service. Our debt service costs as a percentage of GDP went as high as 17% of GDP, and higher if you were to consider the principal repayments, actually, much higher than that. And in the context of an economy where you generate 26% of GDP in terms of revenue, you immediately begin to see that there's a precious little for your recurring expenditures, let alone putting aside money to invest for the long term. Over the past few years, we have been able to reverse that trend, thankfully, And in the last 4 years alone, we have been able to double capital expenditure, both as a percentage of GDP and in dollar terms. In 2015, capital expenditure was approximately 30 billion Jamaican dollars, and in the 2019-20 budget, we're projecting capital expenditure of $72 billion, which is almost, not quite, but almost 2.5 times in just 4 years. We have also had the problem in Jamaica of budget execution, that capital expenditure is set at a particular level, but it is set on the basis of over-optimistic revenue forecasts, and when the revenue forecasts are not met, the first thing that suffers is capital expenditure, and that has been Jamaica's history that is supported by data that you can verify over the past 10 to 15 years. In more recent times, in the last 3 years, we have been able to reverse that, and our budget execution, as far as capital expenditure is concerned, has been getting better. And in the last financial year, those who have been paying attention will recall that we increased the capital expenditure budget twice, in a supplementary in September and also again in January. Capital expenditure is taking center stage. Now, within capital expenditure, you have various subcomponents, of which infrastructure is just one. So one can have capital expenditure that deals with communication systems for the police. Well, that is not what we mean by infrastructure, right? So even though we have doubled capital expenditure as far as a percentage of GDP is concerned, we're at about 3% of GDP, and we have doubled in absolute sense. Our spending on infrastructure, which has also increased, but it is lower than we would want it to be for us to be able to achieve the development that we want. And we're going to have to allocate more to infrastructure if that is going to become a reality. Having said that, in the last financial year, we allocated over $20 billion to the MIDP program, and you have definitely seen those funds at work. So, infrastructure has been, certainly infrastructure spending is critical to growth and development. Our ability to spend has been compromised by the fact that we have been indebted. That is changing quickly, and we have been able to ramp up over the past few years to allocate to capital and infrastructure in a way that we have not in the past. Now, when you look at the requirements over the next several years, and infrastructure goes beyond roads and bridges, it includes drains and water systems and sewage systems. And we would have experienced, and we'd have heard Prime Minister's presentation in Parliament about the pressures that have been placed on our water and our sewage systems and the investments that are required over the next several years in generation of potable water, in storage of water, and in distribution of water. And when you look at the total requirement over the next, immediate total requirement, we have to find a way to allocate $5 billion to relay the pipeline on the Spanish Town Road that takes water from the Rio Cobra into Kingston. But when you look on what is required over the next 10 years, there would be a difficulty for government revenues alone to finance the infrastructure investments that are required for water alone, let alone roads and highways and ports and airports and other forms of infrastructure. If we are to achieve what we need to achieve, there's no doubt that we have to broaden the financing possibilities and financing envelope to include private sector sources in all areas of infrastructure, in water, sewage, roads, highways, bridges, and so forth. The good news is that we have some experience in doing that. And the Development Bank of Jamaica, along with their technical advisors, have executed on a number of these PPP arrangements to good effect. Under this administration, the Kingston Container Terminal of the Port Authority of Jamaica was successfully divested by way of a PPP, though that was a culmination of a multi-year process that actually started at the tail end of the Golden administration, continued through the Portia Simpson Miller administration, and was completed 2 years ago. That was a very successful process by which the physical assets remain in Jamaica. They're merely transferred to the operator on the basis that the operator would invest in the dredging and other requirements to make the port available to larger vessels. And the operators have embarked on a $400 million expansion of the Kingston Container Terminal, capital that the government simply would not have been able to provide. We were also successful in the divestment of the Norman Manley International Airport by way of a similar process, a PPP. And again, the new operators will be investing over $100 million in the expansion of that, of the airport, money that the government would not have been able to find. So we have good experience in attracting private capital to public infrastructure projects. Indeed, there was a report that came out produced by the Economist Intelligence Unit that ranks Jamaica number 4 in the entire Latin American space in public-private partnerships. I think that's something that deserves a round of applause. In all of Latin America, including Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and Chile and Colombia and Trinidad, DOMREP and Jamaica, Jamaica ranks number 4 by the Economist Intelligence Unit in PPPs. The ranking is based on a number of categories and subcategories, and some of the categories include their business and investment climate, the maturity of the PPP environment, financing, and other components. As far as the business and investment climate, they rank as number 5 in Latin America. As far as the maturity of our PPP environment, we are ranked as number 1 in the entire Latin American unit. Now, that is not something that I am saying. That is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. And they do so on the basis, the ranking of the maturity is on the basis of our laws and on the basis of the regulation that people can come here with confidence, enter into long-term 35-year contracts with the government of Jamaica, as they have done for highways, they've done for ports, they've done for airports, and operate with confidence. We rank number 1, and that is something to be proud of. However, when it comes to financing, we rank number 13. Now, 13 is much better than 15 and 17 and 18, but it's not number 1. And it's not number 3 or 4 or 2. And we rank 13 as far as financing is concerned because we have not yet, in sufficient quantities, found a way to have big private sector dollars in infrastructure financing. And that remains our sort of challenge and the next sort of phase in infrastructure development in Jamaica. And we want to be able to attract private sector financing for infrastructure in an open, competitive, and transparent way. The competition that we were able to engender for the Norman Manley International Airport resulted in pricing that is very attractive to the government of Jamaica. There was a time when our procurement of energy infrastructure, and I want you to go back to the 1990s, right? We have a monopoly provider of energy, but we also have independent power producers. And in the 1990s, we entered into independent power contracts on a direct negotiated basis. Those of you who are close to that sector would know the names Dr. Bird, 1. You'd know the names Dr. Bird, 2, which were the colloquial names for IPPs that were procured in the 1990s. And those were done on a direct negotiated basis. For good reason at the time, because the infrastructure, the technology that's required to engage in an open tender that's competitive didn't exist, and there might have been emergency conditions that required a direct negotiation. But one of the features of direct negotiation is that you can end up in a situation that you have an arrangement that is attractive to the private sector player, but may not be so great for the government. And indeed, in retrospect, those direct negotiated contracts in the 1990s and shortly after for energy were very rich. That's not a criticism, because that was what we could do at that time. It's not a criticism, but it is a fact. And as we have, as a country, been able to bring on the technology that allows us to engage in open and competitive tenders, our pricing has improved over time. So much so that we were finally able to procure LNG at a price that we didn't think we could. And who knows, we could probably even do better if we were to do it again. Our open and competitive approach as far as renewables yielded great fruit. I think it was 2 years ago when we had the renewable tender, which was massively oversubscribed, and we have projects such as the Great Rivers project in Westmoreland that have come out as a result of that with with single-digit pricing for electricity. In the same way that it has taken time for us to graduate from direct negotiation into open, competitive, and transparent procurement on the energy space, but once we have gotten there, we see the benefits to Jamaica, we must engage in the same transformation as far as infrastructure projects are concerned. And here I'm talking about big infrastructure. Clearly, we do procurement for minor roads and community roads and so forth. But the technology to do so has to be developed in the same way that we would have had to develop the means by which to engage in open and transparent tenders in energy. And we are working with the U.S. Treasury Department in the Office of Technical Assistance from the U.S. Treasury Department to assist us in building the capacity in Jamaica to engage in open, transparent, and competitive procurement for infrastructure. I don't know if you understand the significance of that, but if you did, you would give a round of applause. Because we are saying that infrastructure is important. What we're seeing going, in the future is that we will be able and we must allocate larger and larger sums to infrastructure, but in doing so, we all have a vested interest in ensuring that we get the best possible deal for the Jamaican people. And the way to be able to secure and to know that we have the best possible deal is that we procure these services in an open, competitive, and transparent way. It is not going to happen overnight. It will take some time for the capacity to be built. But that does not mean that we do not start. And so I'm very happy that the U.S. Treasury has made experts available to assist us in that graduation. Because make no mistake about it, with all of the needs that we have for infrastructure developments and all that our people want as far as access to quality and reliable and durable infrastructure, the government will not be able to do it alone. But when we do it in conjunction with the private sector, we must be able to have the assurance and to be able to assure the Jamaican people that we are getting the best deal